April 26, 1901. Clayton, New Mexico. The crowd that gathered in the town square that morning came expecting the clean version, the version they'd been told about, the lever pulled, the drop taken, justice administered in a single decisive moment. What they witnessed instead followed them for the rest of their lives. Some of them never spoke about it directly. Those who did use the same word, every one of them, without coordination, without consultation, they called it a mistake. As if the word mistake was large enough to contain what happened when the trapdoor opened and the rope went taut, and the man named Tom Ketchum stopped being a man in the most literal and irreversible way imaginable. Welcome to the raw frontier. Today you are going inside the mechanics of frontier justice at its most catastrophically human. The science of the gallows that almost no one on the frontier actually understood. The specific and agonizing ways in which that ignorance expressed itself in front of crowds of hundreds. And the documented history of executions that transformed the town square into something no one who attended had any framework to process. Hollywood built the hanging scene with the same care applied to everything else on the frontier, which is to say it built it to be bearable. The polished scaffold, the sheriff reading the sentence in a clear voice, the condemned man standing straight, hat removed, perhaps offering a final stoic statement about the territory or the Lord or a particular woman who had made his choices what they were. The lever, the drop, the body swinging in a clean arc, still immediate, the mechanism of death so efficient and so swift that the crowd disperses with a sense of order restored. Justice is punctuation, a period at the end of a violent sentence. The reality required an understanding of physics that the frontier rarely had on hand. The science of judicial hanging, as it was understood by the late 19th century in the more developed institutions of the East and in Britain, was genuinely precise. There existed tables, documented, calculated, tested tables that correlated a condemned man's body weight against the required drop distance to produce a specific outcome, the fracture dislocation of the cervical vertebrae, specifically between the second and third vertebral bodies, causing immediate and complete disruption of the spinal cord. When it worked correctly, death was neurologically instantaneous. The body dropped, the rope arrested the fall, the neck broke at the precise calculated point, and the individual was gone before the nervous system had time to register what had happened. The position of the knot was not incidental to this calculation. It was central to it. The large fixed loop of a properly constructed hangman's knot was designed to sit beneath and slightly behind the left ear, positioned so that the sudden arrest of the fall would snap the head backward and to the right with specific rotational force that targeted the vertebral junction with maximum mechanical efficiency. The knot placement was the difference between an execution and an ordeal. Move it to the back of the neck, and you change the vector of force entirely. Move it to the front, and you change it again. Each variation produced a different outcome, and only one of those outcomes was the intended one. On the frontier, the sheriff conducting an execution was usually not a man who had studied these tables. He was a man who had been elected or appointed to maintain order in a settlement, who had experience with firearms and occasionally with physical confrontation, and who was now being asked to perform a technical procedure that had a margin for error measured in fractions of an inch and fractions of a pound. He looked at the condemned man. He looked at the rope. He made his best judgment, and the crowd assembled in the square was about to find out whether that judgment was sufficient. When the drop was too short, what followed belonged to a different category of event entirely. Insufficient drop distance meant insufficient force. Insufficient force meant the cervical vertebrae did not fracture. The spinal cord was not disrupted. The condemned man fell. The rope caught him. And he remained entirely, agonizingly conscious inside a body that was now suspended by its own neck with the full weight of every pound it contained pressing down on the airway and the blood vessels supplying the brain. This is strangulation, not instantaneous, not clean, a process. The face changed color through a sequence that the witnesses closest to the scaffold described in consistent detail across multiple historical accounts. The initial flush, blood trapped below the point of constriction, the face darkening toward a deep crimson. Then, as hypoxia progressed and the vascular pressure built beyond what the tissues could contain, the progression toward purple, towards something darker than purple. The eyes, subjected to that same internal pressure with nothing external to contain it, responded in ways that the crowd standing in the town square had not expected and could not look away from. The tongue, no longer under muscular control, emerged. The body, deprived of coordinated neurological function, but not yet dead, convulsed. The limbs moved in patterns that had nothing to do with intention. The diaphragm attempted to fulfill its function against an obstruction it could not overcome. This continued for minutes, not seconds. The documented accounts from frontier hangings that went wrong in this direction record durations of 15 minutes, some record longer. The crowd that had come for a swift resolution stood in silence that became, as the minutes extended, something closer to shared trauma. The sheriff stood at the side of the scaffold. There was nothing to be done. The mechanism was in motion. Intervention would have required either cutting the rope, which no legal or social framework supported, or climbing the scaffold and adding weight to the body to accelerate the process, which some sheriffs did, dangling from the legs of the still-living man to bring an end to what the drop had failed to deliver. The sphincter muscles, which in life are maintained by continuous neurological tension, released. The crowd in the front rows registered this development through their senses in sequence. They had come to witness justice. What they witnessed was something that the word justice was not designed to contain. Then there was the other kind of error, the kind that produced the opposite problem. A heavier man required a shorter drop. This was a fundamental counterintuitive truth of the calculation that the frontier's improvised executioners most consistently failed to internalize. The weight of the body was not in opposition to the rope's work. It was a multiplier. A heavier man dropping a given distance generated more force than a lighter man dropping the same distance. Give a heavy man too much rope, and the force generated at the moment the drop arrested was not therapeutic. It was not targeted. It was simply tremendous, applied to the neck of a human being whose tissues had a defined tolerance that the calculation had just exceeded. Tom Ketchum had spent his months in the Clayton jail eating. He had been a lean outlaw for most of his career, a man of the trail in the hard country of New Mexico and Texas, wanted for robbery and violence, and a particular lawlessness that the territory's remoteness had permitted for years. But incarceration had changed his physical profile, and the sheriff making the final preparations for the execution on the morning of April 26 was working from measurements and assumptions that no longer accurately reflected the man standing on the scaffold. The drop was too long. The calculation was wrong in the direction that no one wants to be wrong. When the trapdoor opened and the rope went taut, the force produced at the end of that drop was not designed to fracture and dislocate. It was sufficient to do something that the crowd had assembled with no conceptual framework to anticipate. The rope did not break the neck. The rope, under the force of a heavy man falling too far, exceeded the structural tolerance of the anatomical connection it was meant to merely interrupt. The sound was described by witnesses as something that did not have a precedent in their experience. Not the sharp crack of a clean execution, something wet and total, a single event of physical separation that the crowd's collective nervous system processed as wrong before the visual information had fully registered. The head left the body. It came to rest on the ground below the scaffold. The torso, still suspended by the rope that had not in any technical sense failed, hung above it. The witnesses in the front rows were subjected to the immediate physical aftermath of a major vascular disruption at close proximity, something they had not been told to prepare for, and that their clothing and the memories they carried home that evening confirmed in detail. The sheriff of Clayton, New Mexico, had to stand at the side of that scaffold and be present for what his calculation had produced. The crowd that had gathered for the closure of a legal proceeding stood in a town square that had become, in a single second, a scene that the local newspaper would struggle for days to find language adequate to describe. Tom Ketchum had been a violent man. The crimes for which he was executed were real. The sentence was legal and documented, and had moved through the available apparatus of frontier justice with appropriate formality. None of that context altered what the morning of April 26th produced in the people who were present for it. Justice and catastrophe had arrived simultaneously and could not be separated from each other. The law had been applied. The application had been a disaster. Both of these things were true at the same time, and the town of Clayton carried both of them. Ketchum's case was the most documented, the most photographed, the most written about, but it was not singular. The pattern of executions gone wrong in both directions. the rope too short producing prolonged agonies, and the rope too long producing something categorically worse, repeated across the frontier with consistency that reflected the consistent absence of professional training in the men responsible for conducting them. Some sheriffs witnessed their first botched execution and spent years afterward educating themselves, consulting the tables, taking the measurements seriously. Others moved from one error to the next, each time certain that this time the judgment would be sufficient. The scaffold was supposed to represent the frontier's aspiration toward civilization, the formality of a sentence, a proceeding, a determined date and time and manner. It was the alternative to mob, to the immediate and extra-legal violence that the same territory was simultaneously known for. It was meant to be the version that involved procedure instead of passion, structure instead of raw force. But procedure without knowledge is theater. Structure built by hands that do not understand the forces involved is decoration. The frontier gallows was, too often, not an instrument of measured justice, but a demonstration of what happens when a community decides to perform a technical act without acquiring the technical competence to perform it. The result was absorbed by the condemned man's body, and by the crowd standing in the town square, and by the sheriff, who had to look at what the morning had become and understand that his miscalculation was the reason for all of it. They were trying to be civilized. The trying was real. The gap between the intention and the outcome was real in a different way. And it was a crowd that closed that gap with their presence, their witness, and their inability to forget what they had seen. Which version of that morning would you have chosen if the choice were yours? The rope too short and 15 minutes of what the crowd standing at that scaffold experienced, or the rope too long and a single second that ended everything in a way that no one in that square had been told to expect? There is no right answer. There is only the question and the honest discomfort of sitting with it. Leave your answer in the comments. And if you believe that what happened on the scaffold represents the outer boundary of what frontier justice could produce, consider what existed below the surface of those same towns. The cells where men waited for their appointment with the scaffold were not merely confining. They were their own particular kind of ordeal, a slow biological emergency conducted underground and out of sight. Click on our video about the dysentery pits of the frontier jails. What happened below the streets of those towns had been waiting for someone to look directly at it. Raw, visceral, history, this is the raw frontier.